Manchester Museum has a fine collection of Egyptian antiquities, which includes 17 human mummies and various animal mummies as well. About 7 years ago, it was decided to investigate this collection as fully as possible using as many scientific and medical techniques as were available. These were readily to hand in the various teaching hospitals and departments of the University of Manchester. Our aims on the project were twofold. First of all, we wanted to find out as much as possible about causes of disease in the mummies and, where possible, the actual cause of death. We also wanted to look at evidence for living conditions in ancient Egypt and the process of mummification itself. And secondly, we wanted to establish a methodology for the examination of a group of mummies of this type, which other institutions could use and apply to their own collections, modifying them to their own needs. This film deals with the investigation using the various techniques on the project.
The scientific value of X-ray procedures in the study of Egyptian remains has been appreciated only in recent years. So far, most investigations have been carried out in museums or at archaeological sites, where the need to use mobile equipment and local electricity supplies has caused many difficulties. This radiological investigation has been carried out by taking each specimen to the Department of Neuroradiology at Manchester Royal Infirmary. Modern equipment is available with high-powered generators, making it possible to employ fine-grain industrial film and controlled processing to improve image quality. Fluoroscopy, or X-ray screening, on special orbiting equipment was carried out first on each subject. The amplified X-ray image was viewed directly on a television monitor, and in this way, the nature and disposition of the remains within the wrappings were identified and marked on the outer casing. A radiographic survey in 2 planes then provided a basic plan and elevation. From this initial survey, more detailed studies employing tomography and stereoscopy were devised. Conventional radiographs are only 2-dimensional projections of 3-dimensional structures, so that dense, overlying material frequently obscures important detail. Tomography is a special X-ray technique enabling slices of tissue between 1 and 2 millimeters in thickness to be displayed in any selected plane. 2 mummies were investigated by computed tomography using the EMI whole-body scanner. Now, this very recent technique is designed to obtain extremely detailed numerical information about transverse body sections. Mummy 1770 was subjected to further radiological scrutiny after unwrapping in order to permit a detailed study to be made of the dissected parts. Such sophisticated radiological methods have enabled scientific studies to be made of skeletal maturity, embalming techniques, cultural developments, and many of the diseases and afflictions of this ancient civilization. Knowledge of the teeth of mummies is best gained by visual inspection, and this is impossible in the case of whole mummies. Most of our knowledge of teeth and their abnormalities is derived from dry skulls. These show the teeth and their supporting bony structures, but not the gum and its covering of soft tissue. The condition of this we can readily imagine, because any prolonged pathological changes have an effect on the alveolar bone beneath. The ancient Egyptians were lucky in that they had well-developed jaws and the teeth were well calcified. Nevertheless, most of the non-pathological abnormalities that we come across today are to be found: extra teeth, missing teeth, buried and crowded teeth. Decay seldom occurred with the peoples of dynastic Egypt. However, in Greco-Roman times, many instances are to be seen where teeth are affected by caries. The one almost universal abnormality was wear of the cusps and crowns of the teeth. As people got older, the wear extended to the body of the tooth. In more fortunate cases, a deposition of secondary dentine in the pulp chamber kept pace with the wear. But when that did not happen, the nerve of the tooth was exposed and an apical abscess resulted. Because of the continuous and abnormal grinding of mastication, the bone surrounding the tooth became diseased and absorbed. This resulted in the loosening of the tooth, and eventually it would drop out. The cause of the excessive wear was eventually revealed. Specimens of ancient Egyptian bread of various epochs were x-rayed, and a piece the size of a man's thumb was found to contain enough mineral fragments to cover the bottom of a test tube. These were mainly quartz from desert sand, but soil and quern were also found. All in all, those who had the misfortune to die young had no dental problem. But from early adult times to senility, the problems arising from bad teeth must, for many, have caused much unhappiness, ill health, and in some cases, even a premature death. Pieces of bandage from the wrappings were inspected, and the weave density of the various types determined. Under the microscope, the characteristics of the fibers appeared similar to modern flax or linen fibers. The dark brown appearance of the bandages suggested that the fibers had been impregnated with resinous material. Techniques used in medicine for extraction, separation, and identification of natural products were applied to the analysis of these materials. Various solvents were used to extract samples from the bandages, and evaporation of these solutions left residues, varying in appearance from pale and waxy to dark brown and treacly. Further separation of these crude extracts was achieved by various chromatographic techniques. For thin layer chromatography, a small amount of an extract is applied to the edge of a layer of adsorbent, coated onto a glass plate. Solvent is then allowed to flow up the plate, carrying with it components of the extract, which are separated according to their different rates of travel. Components of beeswax and galbanum, an aromatic gum resin, were identified, and their presence confirmed by spectroscopic techniques. Gas-liquid chromatography was also used. The extract is injected into the instrument, and the peaks produced on the chart represent the components of the mixture. A combination of simple chemical analysis and sophisticated atomic absorption and neutron activation analysis was used to identify sulfur, molybdenum, and vanadium in the ash of the bandages. This led to the conclusion that bitumen from the Dead Sea had probably also been used to impregnate the wrappings. Some of the outer bandages were stuck together with glue, which was shown by chromatography and amino acid analysis to be gelatin. The extracts couldn't be completely identified, but the use of modern analytical techniques have revealed new information on the materials used in mummy wrappings. Pathology is concerned with the diagnosis of disease, both by the naked eye and by the use of the microscope. The eye recognizes variations in the appearance of an organ which indicate the presence of disease. It's important, therefore, to record exact details before the organ is interfered with in any way. Due to the dry state of tissues in mummies, some of these indicators of disease are difficult to recognize. For instance, in 1770, the nature of these amputation sites were examined. Signs of healing at the ends of the bones would indicate that the child had survived for more than a week or so after amputation, but there were no such signs. Examination of these fragments of lung from the two brothers revealed quite different tissue on the surface, which eventually turned out to be from the wall of the heart. This indicates the presence of inflammation between the heart and the lungs during life. The tissue is dry, friable, and usually very hard. So to prepare it for study under a microscope, it's first placed in a rehydrating fluid, usually 5% formal saline. Compare this rehydrated lung tissue with the original, and you can see that it has virtually regained its normal appearance. So has this hand. A machine is normally used to immerse the tissue in several different grades of alcohol before it's set in paraffin wax. To prevent damage, mummified tissue is dealt with entirely by hand. Sections of 5 microns in thickness can be cut on a microtome. The normal histological stains didn't always work satisfactorily with mummified tissue. Trial and error ultimately produced some worthwhile results. Here is a blood vessel from the hand of a mummy. And here, the glands lining the intestine can be seen. Histological sections also helped us to diagnose disease. This slide shows sand pneumoconiosis in the lung, while here, there's a worm infestation of the intestines. Electron microscopy's two major advantages over other techniques are the fineness of detail produced in the images and the very small pieces of material required for examination. 3 techniques have been used in this project: transmission, analytical, and scanning electron microscopy. The material for transmission and analytical methods was rehydrated and embedded in a plastic from which ultra-thin sections were cut. On the transmission instrument, these were positioned onto 3mm diameter specimen grids, stained, loaded onto a holder, and each grid retained by a circlip. This holder was placed into the column, the air evacuated, and an electron beam passed through the section, producing an image on the fluorescent screen. The detail resolved is 1,000 times smaller than that attainable by light microscopy. Tissue from various mummies was examined. The liver of Necht Ankh was exceptionally well preserved, and the outlines of cells, cell nuclei, and some cytoplasm components were easily recognizable. Of special significance was the identification of centrioles, which control the division of cell nuclei. An analytical microscope produces an image on a screen, but it also displays a chemical analysis of specific areas. Lung tissue from Necht Ankh contained crystalline deposits encased in fibrous tissue. These contained silicon, showing that he'd suffered from sand pneumoconiosis. The remains of many insects were examined by scanning electron microscopy. Fragile specimens are thinly coated in gold to reflect the electron beam, placed in the microscope on a gimbal mount, and scanned to provide a television image. These pictures are visually spectacular because of the detail and depth of focus. Two major groups of insects were found in the mummies. Blowflies need a moist food source, so these were probably laid soon after death and prior to the drying of the body during embalming. The beetles are not hampered in this respect and could invade the body or its surroundings at any stage of its history. Carbon-14 is a radioactive isotope of carbon that emits beta rays. In the case of mummy 1770, all the carbon in the sample to be measured was converted to benzene. Carbon-14 beta activity was measured by liquid scintillation counting. Firstly, the sample is burnt in air, and the resulting carbon dioxide gas is purified by converting it to barium carbonate. After being regenerated by acidification, it is trapped at liquid nitrogen temperature to give solid carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is reacted with molten lithium in a stainless steel furnace to give lithium carbide, which, on exposure to water, produces acetylene gas, rather like the old acetylene lamps. This is also trapped at liquid nitrogen temperature to give solid acetylene, which, by the use of a catalyst, gives liquid benzene. This liquid benzene, containing the carbon-14 from the original sample, is mixed with a scintillator, and the carbon-14 beta activity measured on a liquid scintillation counter. Any quantity of carbon-14 decays to half its radioactivity in 5,736 years. Therefore, if the initial and final beta count rates are known and compared, the age of a sample can be determined. The preservation of the body in Egyptian mummification was achieved by the use of natron, a naturally occurring salt mixture. It's normally composed mainly of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate, which are the essential preserving compounds. But there are often large amounts of impurities present, such as sodium chloride, sodium sulfate, and sand. Until recently, it was thought that in order to preserve it, the body was pickled in a natron solution. Experiments have shown that such a method would result in very poor preservation. And it's now thought that the body was buried in a bed of dry natron, and that preservation was brought about by desiccation. Relatively pure natron dries the body quickly. Any soiling of the salt is easily seen, and the affected natron can be removed and the remaining material used again. Where there are high levels of impurities, the preservation is slower, and the degree of soiling makes it difficult to separate any unaffected salt. And this may well account for many instances of poor mummification. The technique of fingerprinting a mummy differs greatly from taking the prints of a living person. With the latter, one finger at a time is inked and rolled onto paper to record the ridges on the skin. The rigidity of the mummy's hand prevented this method being employed. A polysulfide rubber material, used extensively in dentistry, was here used to take a mold of each finger. The base paste is mixed with a catalyst, allowing time to apply it firmly in a semicircle, covering the end of the finger. flexible mold is removed, and an excellent and detailed reproduction of all the characteristics of the finger can be obtained. The mold is coated with several thin layers of acrylic paint. The paint is quick setting, and 5 or 6 coats are sufficient to make an accurate and durable cast of the fingerprint pattern. This acrylic cast is then inked, as in the normal method of fingerprinting. And produces a positive print of the ridge characteristics. Now, this technique ensures a cast of the friction ridges from the entire area of the finger, as opposed to photography, which records only a partial area, with distortion on the periphery. Previous evidence pointed to Azru having been either a temple dancer or a chantress. The latter appears to be much more likely when toe prints, taken by this method, revealed deep and clear furrows inconsistent with a person who had performed ritual dances barefoot. The 2 mummies whose heads were selected for reconstruction were found in these 2 coffins. We know that they were half-brothers and that one was part Negro. The method adopted for the reconstruction of these heads was to establish the thickness of soft tissue at specific sites on the skull. Having done this, it's possible to fill in the areas between them and build up the shape of the face and head. These measurements are based upon the work of Coleman and Buckley, who, at the turn of the century, did a considerable amount of research on adult human specimens. Small pegs were inserted into a plaster cast of the skull at the specific points and cut to the appropriate length. Using modeling clay, the face and head were developed, working strictly to the predetermined measurements. It's interesting to see how quickly the skull changes character and becomes a face, even at the very early stages. All available details concerning age, sex and ethnic group, etc., are carefully studied before any reconstruction is started. There are, of course, certain areas that are open to speculation, particularly the mouth and nose. But the basic architecture of the face is always dependent upon the underlying skull. You can see here how areas of the soft tissues relate very closely to the skull. Although we can't claim that these reconstructions are absolutely accurate, a comparison of the 2 heads clearly demonstrates the ethnic difference referred to in the writings on the coffins. Wearing very simple headgear, they cease to be just archaeological remains and become individuals. Although this reconstruction of the head of 1770 has had glass eyes, skin color, and hair added, the initial work was done using exactly the same techniques that you have just seen.